you find it helpful, please turn in it to Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter. This is where we're going to spend our time today. One of the aspects of being a human being, and I'm sure I'm not telling anybody anything here that's a surprise to them. All we've got to do is have a few conversations about anything, and we recognize right away that we are a forgetful race of beings. We think of things that we think to be important. We try to remember. I can't tell you how many jobs I've had, and Dennis probably can relate to this, where a person you talk to about a job, they explain what they want. You've forgotten to carry a notepad or a clipboard or a piece of paper in there with you, and you just think, well, I'll remember it till I get home and I can write it up. And then you go right back on the telephone to call them up because I can't put together two of the things that I was asked to do or any of the things I was told. I don't remember any of it. How big's the room? What color did they? None of that. And it's easy to forget things like that. It's also easy to forget things that are really, really, really important. Those principles that God gives us by which we should live. We forget them. And that's why when you look at the book of Deuteronomy, you see Moses over and over and over and over again saying, remember, remember. Let's take a look at the text. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, I'll begin reading in verse 1. Now Israel, pay attention to the statutes and the ordinances I'm about to teach you so that you would live and go on and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving to you. Do not add a thing to what I command, nor subtract from it, so that you might keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm delivering to you today. You've witnessed what the Lord did at Baal Peor, how he eradicated from your midst everyone who followed Baal. But you who remain faithful to the Lord your God are still alive to this very day, every one of you. Look, I've taught you the statutes and the ordinances just as the Lord my God told me to do, so that you might carry them out in the land that you're about to enter and possess. So be sure to do them, because this will testify to the nations of your wise understanding, to the people who will learn of all these statutes and say, indeed, this great nation is a very wise people. In fact, what other great nation has a God so near to them, like the Lord our God, that whenever we call on him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances just as the whole of this law that I'm about to share with you today? However, pay careful attention, lest you forget the things that you've seen and disregard them for the rest of your life. Instead, teach them to your children and to your grandchildren. So, we've got a situation here where Moses is giving them all of these instructions. And if you read, Deuteronomy is literally, it means the second law. That's what it means, Deuteronomos. It's a second iteration of the law. Moses goes through the entire law once again and gives it to them. And if you read the text, you'll find that in many instances, he says, remember. He just tells them to remember. Now, why would he do that? Well, I guess he understands human nature well enough, and the Lord obviously is instructing him. The Lord certainly understands human nature. There's some history here when he speaks about Baal Peor. Peor is a mountain. Baal, of course, is a pagan deity, but Peor is a mountain. And if you read Numbers chapters 20 through 25, you see this whole series of events where Balaam was brought in and told to curse Israel by Balak, the king of a pagan nation. He was taken up onto the top of Mount Peor and looked down on all of the Jews in the valley and was told to curse them. And of course, the god of the pagan king was Baal. So they called the mountain Baal Peor, the mountain of Baal. But this idea of being reminded here is significant, not just for the people of Israel at this point in their history, but also for us. The letter to the Hebrews, the writer says this. He says, therefore we must pay closer attention to what we have heard so that we do not drift away. Now, some texts will say, pay more earnest heed to what you've learned so that you'll not drift away. But what's going on with this idea of drifting? I mean, what is that telling us? Well, first of all, it tells me that we, especially in this culture, we are so contented We're fed, we're watered, we've got air conditioning, we've got refrigerators with food in it, we've got transportation, we've got entertainment. There's so much for us here that the voice of God becomes just drowned out. I mean, who's got time to listen to anything that God would say? And the easiest thing in the world for any human being to do, especially with things like God's principles, is to drift. It requires no effort at all to drift. All you've got to do is just stop trying. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, if you take 100 people and you question all of them and do a survey and ask them, why did they leave Christianity? Why did they abandon it? He said, very few of them are going to tell you that somebody came up with a really persuasive argument that got them to think differently. What they'll probably tell you is they just sort of fell away from it by osmosis, by just drifting away. There was no sense of somebody pulling them away. The subtlest of tugs kept them from continuing on in the faith. I think that's true. A poet has said this. He says, let me go home before dark, before I shame you, Lord. That just says so much. I mean, Billy Graham was interviewed once on Larry King. And Larry asked Billy Graham, do you have any fears? And Billy Graham said, I do have one fear. He said, I fear that I'll go out and do something that embarrasses the Lord. I thought, wow. Just that he would embarrass Jesus. By what? By just not being attentive to being a follower of Jesus. And all it takes is a moment. I mean, how many of us are guilty of that? Every day, this is maddening for me. I'll share this with you in my own personal life. Every day when I pray, God, make me salt and light today. Somehow, that I'm going to be salt and light. And inevitably, something occurs, usually between Becky and me, where I just totally forget that I've prayed to be salt and light. And I got a sharp response, or I'm easily disgusted, or I just forget it. There's a poet that also says, the wearing of the tide of years puts out the fire. I think that's so true. You look at the beach and you see the high tide and the water's way up high, and then as the water recedes, that huge area of beach that's so smooth, the water just wears it like a parking lot out there. No footprints, no nothing, no marks. The water just makes it perfectly smooth. The tide of years just wears away at our desire to say, today I want to count somehow for God, if it's nothing but a hand on the shoulder for somebody that needs it. The writer to the Hebrews was writing to a very specific group. They were under persecution by Nero at that time in history. Nero, as you know, there was a big fire in Rome, and a lot of historians think that Nero actually set the fire. Now, I don't know that. There are some who think that. But let's say he didn't. But Nero then picked a group of people to blame the fire upon. It was the Christians. And there were lots of them put to death and tortured because of that. So that's what this church, that this writer of this letter to the Hebrews is writing to a church that's being persecuted in that way. And he's telling them to be careful that you don't drift. Can you imagine? I mean, if your whole life trajectory is that of being a follower of Jesus and you could be killed for it, I doubt you're going to think very much about drifting anywhere. But he's reminding them not to drift. How much more so you and me in our air-conditioned, cushy life are we going to drift? Do you know what the word drifting, there's a word we use in the Bible. We use it in Christian terms. It's called apostate. An apostate is somebody who turns away from the faith. But do you know where the word comes from? It's a Greek word, apostosia. Do you know what that word means? Not climbing. That's what it means, not climbing. It's a word that tells us that when we're apostate from the faith, we're not pursuing it. We're not climbing. It's the word picture is that of a person on a hillside that is steep enough that if they don't continue to claw ahead, they will slide back. And you hear that term in church, right? You've all heard that term, the backslider. That's where it comes from. Apostasia, not climbing. Do you know 50 minutes before Pearl Harbor happened, Dennis probably knows this, they saw the planes, the Japanese planes coming, 50 minutes before they arrived at Hawaii. But the lieutenant who was on duty there said, there are planes coming out of California, don't worry about it. What would Pearl Harbor have been with 50 minutes of warning to get our planes in the air and meet them before they ever got to the island? That's the danger of drifting. So what are some of the hazards? I mean, why would we drift? Well, there are lots of reasons. It's not hard to think about them, but just think about it from inside the church itself. I think one of the major features of drifting is the fact that we become so familiar with the gospel, so familiar with Noah's Ark and Moses, and the Ten Commandments, and the Sermon on the Mount, the healing of the man with the withered hand, on and on and on. All these things that we've heard so many times. I mean, when you think about, just take the sermon time, there's nothing new. You know, there's only the one Bible with what's in there. There's nothing new. We're preaching from the same book for 2,000 years now. So we become familiar with it. And the longer we're believers, the more familiar with it we become. And over time, the excitement, I don't know what it was like for you, but I remember when I became a believer. I remember it very, very well. I know exactly what I was doing. I know where I was. I know the date. And in that becoming a believer, I was so excited about the fact that I'd been forgiven until I was obnoxious to people. I was. That was all I wanted to talk about with anybody that would take up the time with me. But now, years go by, and that fire kind of goes out. Becomes just part of living. I don't know what that means. I mean, I think about us in this country, in anybody's house, I wonder how many Bibles. I bet you in our house, if I were to look carefully, I could come up with 10 in our house alone. Not even counting the ones on the computer and the telephone. I could easily find 10 hard copy Bibles in our house. But how much influence does that book really have on our daily affairs as we go through life? G.K. Chesterton said, and I think this is so wise, he says, there are many angles at which a person can fall. There's only one angle at which they can stand straight. I think that's right. I think that's right. I have a cousin who's a legit musician. I don't consider myself legit because, I mean, I can read music a little bit. This guy, 4-year degree and then a master's. And he wrote the score for the percussion track for the Rocky IV movie. I mean, he's a legit musician. Excellent, excellent drummer. And plays all manner of percussion instruments, some of which you've never even heard of. And we were talking one day. We talk about music a lot because we share a love for it. And he was talking to me about improvising. Now, if you don't know what that is, if you're a musician, an improviser is somebody who, there'll be chord changes going by, and you make up something to play over those changes. That's improvising. If you hear a guitar solo or a keyboard solo on the radio, something like that, it's something that somebody just came in and they made it up on the spot. And he would ask me questions about that, and he'd say, how do you do that? And we'd talk about that for a long time. We got into a conversation once about playing music. And he said, you know, the funny thing is, he says, sometimes I get in these ruts where I don't practice for a long time. And he said, what I want to do is all in my head. I know how to do it. The motor skills are there, but when I go to execute the motor skills, I can't do it. He said, because I haven't practiced. The knowledge is all there, but nothing can come out because I've not practiced. And yet in my head, I feel ready to play all the time. You know, for Christians, there's a place at which if there's not practice, then it just becomes a bunch of knowledge that we get so familiar with over time, it doesn't do anything for us. There are no juices flowing when we stop to think about what it is to be a believer. I think it's very much connected to what I would call the practice of the awkward. I mean, how many times do we walk up to somebody and say, is there something I could be praying for you about? Can I pray for you right now? Think about this drifting idea. Look at somebody who I would say I would have loved to have been as close to the Lord as, say, a Solomon. And think about Solomon. I mean, what a great thing he did. Remember, he takes over the kingdom. Now, some of the stuff he did prior to taking the kingdom over doesn't look so great to me, but we'll leave that aside. It's an ancient history. It's Near Eastern ancient history. Maybe back then that's the kind of way you conducted yourself, so we won't let that go. But think about Solomon. He prays. He's going to take over the kingdom. He says to God, I'm just a child and I'm going to rule all these people. I don't have the chops. God says, well, what would you ask me for, Solomon? I'd love it if God would do that for me. He says, Lord, give me the wisdom to rule this people. And God says, you know what? Because you asked me for the wisdom to rule this people, I'm going to give you the wisdom and everything else too. And he did. Solomon was a big king. Did you know they dug up the stables where Solomon, it says Solomon stabled 40,000 horses? He did. I mean, he was a big deal. And you read Ecclesiastes and you see this guy who tried everything that it was possible to try, he did in his time because he could. That's how close he was to God. And then you read the trajectory of his life as the king, and he builds an altar to Molech where they cook children alive for the church service. Now, how did he go from being this person so close to God to being okay with having children cooked alive to a pagan deity? How did that happen? He drifted. Didn't happen all at once. It was a slow process. It was invisible to him that this was happening. But slowly but surely he drifted. Why? Because he was no longer practicing the awkward. No longer digging in. Apostasia, no longer climbing. No longer climbing. You ever think about these football players? I do. I hate to admit this about myself, but I would love it if I just had $1 million. I would. Because you think about it, if you just had it in a passbook account, back when passbooks would pay you 3 or 4%, I mean, you're making $30,000, $40,000 a year just on the interest. I mean, $1 million, man, you're set. You don't have to worry about anything. And then I watch these football players who play football. You read about somebody coming right out of college, they give them $20 million just to sign the contract. They don't even have to do anything. And then they're paying them millions of dollars every year to play. And so let's say they play 5 years and they walk away with $80 million. Pay the taxes on it, you've got $45 million. $45 million. And then 5 years later, they're broke. How do you do that? I mean, unless you're just, I don't even know how you take $45 million bills and lose them in 5 years. I don't even know if you tossed one out every second for that 5 years, if you could lose $45 million. I've never done the math. How did they get to that place? They stopped climbing. They just stopped climbing. Why did they stop climbing? Because they got bored. And that's a huge problem for us. We just get bored because we don't see the interest in what it is that God has given us any longer. It's not interesting to us anymore. It becomes just the same old over time. G.K. Chesterton also said there are no uninteresting things. I think he's right about that. He said only uninterested people. I think he's right about that too. The surest way to drift as a believer is to just neglect the basic disciplines. And there are some very basic ones. Pray. If we're not praying, we will fail everywhere else. Just put that in the pocket on a piece of paper. If I don't pray, I'll fail everywhere, because that's the truth. If we're not in some way having contact with the Bible, just a little bit, ongoingly, the Word isn't going to change us. How's it going to change us if we're not in contact with it? If we're not fellowshipping with other believers in any way, then we're not having that interaction with like-minded people. And that's probably the hardest for most people in our culture today, is that continuance of fellowship with other believers. If we're not involved in other people's lives, in other words, if you and I aren't placing ourselves into a position of carrying somebody else's portion for them in some way, concerned about them, taking up time with them, visiting with them, speaking with them, praying for them, then we will begin to fail and drift. Those are just the basics. Those aren't hard things. I was at Fernandina Beach once. I used to go there almost every weekend when I was in my late teens, because I could. Once you can drive, man, what the heck? Let's go to Fernandina. And I was very interested in the suntan, and I liked being outside. And what I used to do is I'd go to the beach and I'd throw a frisbee. And if you know how to throw one well into a sea breeze, you can throw it out and it'll come back. So you can just do that all day. And I used to do that all day. It's the only sport I was ever really good at. And one day I was out there doing that, and I saw this kid on a float. He was in probably knee-deep water, just sitting there, bobbing in the waves. And I just kept throwing the frisbee, and there were a lot of people around. And I was so good at it that I could avoid hurting anybody, by throwing it up to catch it. And so I looked out a few hours later, and that kid was out past the breakers. Little kid. I mean, it's a small child on a float. So I went out there and got him. And I was pulling the raft in, and his mother, I'm assuming it was his mother, came running out in the water, splashing and screaming at me, "What are you doing with my kid?" And I said, "Ma'am, he was out past the breakers. I just was bringing him in." What had happened to him? He had drifted. That's all. He just drifted. I'll tell you, if you want evidence of the fact that we as the church are drifting, just look at the things it takes to keep us interested in things in life. It's got to be spectacular. It's got to be amazing. It's got to be quick. It's got to be quick. Can't spend a lot of time. I mean, why do we think people for a vacation will go and bungee jump someplace? Life is just too boring. It's just, there are no edges. There's nothing going on. You walk up to somebody you don't know and put your hand on their shoulder and ask them if you can pray for them. You'll find some edges right quick. Pascal said this. He said, "Happiness is neither inside us nor outside us. It's only through God, who is both in us and around us." I think he's exactly right. And if we lose that sense of calling and living and stop climbing as believers, then we're going to drift. It's just inevitable. That's just who we are. That's why Moses kept saying to them, "Remember." Do you know Deuteronomy is the book of the Bible that Jesus quoted the most? There's a word that the Jews use. It's called the Shema, and we use it as Christians too. What is the Shema? The Shema is a recitation. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." That's the Shema. But the word Shema has a meaning also. Its meaning is pay attention, remember, report, obey. Israel, the reason Moses talked this way to them is he knew. And if you read the history of Israel in the Bible, you see it. One generation away from falling away from God. One generation, always one generation away. And we are no different. One generation. I wonder if this next generation right now that we're witnessing, it will be the generation that falls away. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything, you got a question for me, you want to pray with me, I'll stay here as long as it takes.
Yeah,